climate change going forward. The first is political. The US Leaders Summit on the Climate in April under President Biden's leadership is one of many examples of how the political terrain is shifting rapidly, as is the growing commitment towards net zero emissions by 2050 by countries. The second is economic. Our societies are increasingly confronted by the damage that runaway climate change and ecological degradation wrought on food production, livelihoods, and infrastructure. The third is technological. We are rapidly developing technological solutions across a wide range of fields, including in the renewable energy space, that are increasingly on par or becoming more cost-effective than traditional carbon-intensive solutions. And the fourth is social. There are numerous social movements, both large and small, that are actively advocating for a shift in attitudes in our consumption-driven economies away from plastics and unchecked pollution towards circular economy approaches, protection of our environment, and valuing natural capital. These shifts bode well for a more sustainable future. And in all of these areas, we recognize that partnership between business, government, and civil society actors have an enormous role to play. While the climate challenge is huge, it is not too big if there is a whole of society approach to tackling it. In this context, the P4g initiative has an important role to play as it supports market mechanisms to achieve a global momentum towards green partnerships and climate-friendly investment for impact. This webinar today is hosted in the run-up to the 2021 P4g Seoul Summit at the end of this month that seeks to mobilize investments for transformative partnerships, delivering tangible SDG and climate action impact. Hence, it is my pleasure to briefly introduce our next speaker, Ambassador Chul-Yu Park of the Republic of Korea in South Africa. Ambassador Park has served in the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the past 30 years, including in positions such as the Director of Human Resources in the Policy Division and International Legal Affairs Division, and as Director General of International Legal Affairs. He has also served as the Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative to the Korean Permanent Mission to the United Nations in New York. He holds a Bachelor of Arts from Seoul National University and a Master of Arts in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. Over to you, Ambassador Park, please.
Well, thank you so much for your kind introduction. Good afternoon and good evening. It's an honor and pleasure for my embassy to co-host today's webinar together with Royal Danish Embassy in Pretoria and the South African Institute of International Affairs, SIA. I would like to welcome and thank first Janita Badur, the Senior Policy Advisor of Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries of South Africa, and Leila Lim Surat, the Director of the P4g Secretariat, and my dear colleague Dong-Gyu Lee, Director General for Climate Change from the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for their kind contribution to make this meaningful event happen. As you are well aware, my embassy organized the first climate change webinar last August. And taking into consideration of the grave situation that climate change could be the next pandemic after COVID-19, and also that there is no vaccine for climate change, my embassy is happy to host another climate change webinar today ahead of the upcoming 2021 P4g Seoul Summit from 30 to 31 May this year. 2021, this year, is a critical year in our history of combating climate change because it is the very first year of the comprehensive implementation of Paris Agreement with the P4g Summit and the COP26 UN Climate Change Convention scheduled in May and November, respectively. Although the recent COVID-19 crisis has pushed the planning for climate change down the list of priorities, many countries around the world are joining the race to zero by announcing their carbon neutrality targets. In particular, I welcome the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa announced more ambitious nationally determined contribution target range at the recent Leaders Summit on Climate Change hosted by the US President Joe Biden. I would also like to take note that President Moon Jae-in of the Republic of Korea also promised at the same summit that the Korean government would stop state-backed financing overseas coal plant and submit a more ambitious nationally determined contribution this year. Ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to the Korean government dedication to join international effort to respond to climate change, my government has begun to accelerate the transition to a low carbon and green economy with the announcement of Green New Deal and the vision for 2050 carbon neutrality last year. Above all, resonating the success of the inaugural P4g Summit in Denmark in 2018, the Republic of Korea will host the second P4g Summit in Seoul at the end of May in a virtual format under the theme of inclusive green recovery toward carbon neutrality. It will be Korea's first hosting of the multilateral summit on climate change, which makes it all the more meaningful. I believe that P4g Seoul Summit will provide with an important momentum to bring the international community closer together and strengthen climate action to build back better and greener in the post-COVID world. Last but not least, I would also like to welcome and thank the participation of African environmental NGOs, Energize Africa and Africa Green Co. in today's webinar. I look forward to learning from existing private-public partnership project under the P4g initiative here in South Africa during the discussion of our second session. Ladies and gentlemen, in closing, I hope that today's webinar will serve as an opportunity to raise the visibility of the P4g platform here in South Africa and encourage great participation in the upcoming P4g Summit in Seoul. In this vein, I look forward to a meaningful and productive discussion today. Thank you. Back to Nima.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's now my real pleasure to introduce the first panel. So joining me on the first panel to discuss the development priorities that the P4g initiative seeks to address, emerging out of the policy context, are three experts in the policy field. Our first speaker is Mr. Tongki Lee, Director General for Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Scientific Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Lee has served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the past 25 years and has occupied positions at the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade before becoming Director General of the International Cooperation and Scientific Technology Bureau. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and International Studies, as well as a Master's of Arts in Public Administration from Yonsei University in Seoul, Korea. Finally, Mr. Tongki Lee received the Presidential Citation Award in 2009. Over to you, please, Mr. Lee.
Thank you, Director Ms. Noima Grobella. First of all, please allow me to begin by expressing my gratitude to the South Africa Institute of International Affairs for your help and efforts to organize this meaningful event. My thanks also go to Excellency Ambassador Park Chol-chu, Korean Ambassador to South Africa, who make this event happen. Let me begin by sharing Korea's recent policy initiatives to make a green recovery from COVID-19 while pursuing long-term climate actions. Next slide. Korea announced the Green New Deal and the 2050 carbon neutrality goal in the last year. The Green New Deal is the stimulus package focused on three sectors: energy, green industries, and infrastructure. Korea will be investing some 62 billion US dollar in the next 5 years. As we try to recover from the pandemic through green policy, Korea is also trying to set ambitious long-term goals. Our aim to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 will not be easy to implement, but we will join other global leaders and countries to transform our economy into a low carbon society. Next, please. The sustainability of our planet cannot be assured by ambitions of a single country. We are aware that many countries are making efforts to integrate green elements into their recovery package from the COVID-19 pandemic. Then the task of the international community is to combine and make the most of these efforts in a holistic approach. We have to look for the participation of all stakeholders. Already Noima mentioned about in opening speech. We need to engage with the private sector and civil society. We have to make sure that our citizens are on board. This is where P4g fits into the picture. P4g is the linkage of the existing government action and the new action required. P4g is an action-oriented initiative led by 12 member countries, including South Africa, and partners such as WRI, C40, and GGGI to seek for and nurture public-private partnerships. The implementation of this ambitious goal, such as 2050 carbon neutrality, will heavily rely on the capacity of the private sector, as the P4g aims to foster the private-public partnership for achieving SDGs and green growth. The private sector can bring innovative inputs and cutting-edge technologies that are essential in advancing the transformation of our economy. Next, please. The Republic of Korea will host the 2021 P4g Summit in Seoul on May 30 to 31 under the theme of inclusive green recovery towards carbon neutrality. The P4g Summit will be held virtually in light of COVID-19. Next slide. Let me elaborate on the theme of the summit. First, on inclusive. As we face the challenges of overcoming COVID-19 and the economic crisis, it is important to make sure that we do not leave anyone or any country behind in our recovery efforts. Second, on green recovery. COVID-19 is ironically an opportunity to build back better and greener. Greening our recovery measures will be an important starting point to not only rebuild our economy, but also to provide a strong foundation for longer-term climate policies and actions. Finally, on carbon neutrality. Based on green recovery, we hope that the international community will be able to align the short-term stimulus package with the longer-term climate goals. As we begin to implement the Paris Agreement, achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 will be important to overcome the climate crisis. It is an ambitious target that needs still more commitments around the globe. Next, please. Let me now share the overall summit program. The Green Future Week will be held on the week of May 24th, tackling 10 different sessions on issues that we thought were important in achieving our global goals. The Green Future Week was designed to raise public awareness on P4g and build up the momentum leading up to the summit. There will be 10 special sessions on diverse issues allocated throughout the week, such as green technology, green finance, oceans, and the future generation. The first day of the summit will have 2 high-level segments, the opening ceremony and the leaders session. The opening ceremony will be on our long broadcast program, celebrating the summit, including virtual performances themed on a green future, allowed by an opening speech by the President of Korea. It will be never boring. Immediately after the opening ceremony, the leaders session will begin delivering pre-recorded video messages from the leaders. Day 2 will begin with the 5 thematic sessions. It will be high-level panel discussions on water, energy, circular economy, cities and food and agriculture. The leaders' dialogue will be held with the heads of states participating live. Leaders of the P4g member states and their key stakeholders will be invited to discuss green recovery and carbon neutrality. The leaders' dialogue will continue on to the closing ceremony, where we hope to adopt the Seoul Declaration and announce the next host of the P4g Summit. The P4g Seoul Summit will be a timely opportunity to set out the global vision for carbon neutrality and share best practices to achieve this goal. To this end, we hope to bring together diverse sectors, the private and public sectors, current and future generations, developed and developing countries, so that they may actively interact and exchange their experiences as we reaffirm the global commitment and the solidarity to overcome the climate crisis. Thank you very much.
My apologies. Thank you very much for those opening for the elaboration of the proceedings in the summit. It sounds like a very, very interesting and busy week that will be awaiting the delegates. So thank you very much for that. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Dr. Janita Badul. She's a senior policy advisor for sustainability programs and projects at the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment of the Republic of South Africa. Dr. Badul is, she has been with the department since February 2003. Her professional experience is on the coordination of green economy project planning, and coordination across various spheres of government in collaboration with United Nations agencies and donor partners in relation to the National Green Fund program. Amongst her multilateral portfolio are the Partnership for Action on the Green Economy, Switch Africa Green, and the Partnership for Global Goals and Green Growth. She holds a PhD in plant pathology from the University of Durban. Westall. Thank you, Dr. Badul. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, program moderator, and it is indeed a pleasure to be part of this webinar session, which is a pre-summit event in preparation for the second P4g Summit, which will be hosted by the Republic of Korea. I would want to take this moment to quickly acknowledge Ambassador Reifelt of the Embassy of Denmark, as well as Ambassador Park of the Republic of Korea. Let me also acknowledge Mr. Christopher from the Embassy of Denmark, including Ms. Leila Surat, who is the P4g Hub Director and focal point, as well as Mr. Ntene, who is the regional P4g coordinator for Africa. Also taking into consideration for session 2, Rachel and Anna from the 2 projects which are being financed through the P4g program. So known to all of us, as forestry, fisheries, and the environment, we certainly welcome this opportunity to engage in this pre-summit event. And also taking into consideration the fact that the summit theme, which is an inclusive green recovery towards carbon neutrality, could be not be more apt, considering the current circumstances that we as South Africa, together with the rest of the world, find ourselves in as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And just yesterday, we received news that the Indian variant has also been diagnosed and in South Africa as well, which we know on the global front, India has been devastated by the impact of this variant with regard to the number of infections on a daily basis. So our condolences obviously extend to the current situation which India is currently facing as well. That being said, and in line with what our developmental priorities are, as well as policy imperatives, given the fact that we find ourselves in trying to reignite our economy, whilst we are still experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa itself, I must then allude to some of the findings which the OECD had recently released regarding data from approximately 43 countries, in which they basically reflected on what the economic recovery packages of these different countries and to what extent they actually reflect on and provide support to a green recovery. Surprisingly enough, what we find from the study, which is inclusive of the G20 countries, it takes into consideration the fact that only 17% of the total budget as a combination or collective of against the 43 countries actually amount to dedicated support towards green recovery. And, by the same token, as we reflect on the South Africa's economic reconstruction and recovery plan, we find that we have a combination of support to brownfield as well as transitional and green industries or sectors for the country itself. So not necessarily, congratulating ourselves with regard to the extent of ambition, but I think what needs to be pointed out is that many countries in this recovery period are cognizant of the fact that they are not necessarily completely green, that you are going to find certain industries that are lagging behind. They are those that are
Sorry, Dr. Badal, we've lost you for a moment.
That have been allocated to the green recovery proposal coming through from these different countries. For South Africa itself, from the public fiscus, we have an allocation of 10% of the total budget of 1 trillion rands. Noting that in order to fully realize the potential of the economic reconstruction and recovery plan, we'd have to take into consideration that much of the funds have to be mobilized, and this amounts to approximately 90% of the funds that are required in order for us to transition in the medium to long term to a low carbon as well as inclusive economic recovery process. I would want to then quickly reflect on the different policy imperatives or amendments or reviews which we've undertaken as the Ministry for Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. Last year, during the height or the peak of the lockdown period, our department has been quite engaged with regard to the number of different policy pronouncements that we made. First and foremost, taking into consideration the National Adaptation Strategy. This was followed by the National Integrated Waste Management Strategy, as well as the Extended Producer Responsibility Regulation. And just of recent, which is at the end of March, we, as the department, put out the updated NDC for public commenting. And this definitely takes into consideration the fact that whilst the green economy is a priority within the economic reconstruction and recovery plan, we are cognizant that policies have to be reviewed, have to be updated, and have to make room for such transitional processes to happen in order for us to also realize that we are inclusive and transitioning on a pathway towards an economic recovery that is inclusive and green. The studies related to the economic reconstruction and recovery plan, two of them most specifically were undertaken recently by Oxford University as well as Cambridge Analytics. And basically the findings of the study point to exactly what the OECD findings are against the 43 countries whose data was analyzed on brownfield industry support, transitioning industry support, as well as greenfield industry support. And I think as the world transitions towards low carbon economies, we will definitely in the medium to long term find that many economies will be, to a large extent, be embracing more greener technologies and inform their economic recoveries as well as development for the future from that perspective. Finally, in concluding my initial remarks, I would want to also point out that none of the economic reconstruction and recovery plan imperatives can be realized without ensuring that we are also addressing the vulnerable groups in society. And this, as Ambassador Park also alluded to, we have to take into consideration the vulnerable groups in society, which are inclusive of MSMEs, the youth, as well as the women, and take into consideration empowerment of women in that space and in that regard. Over and above that, we have to also take into consideration and realize the need for upskilling, reskilling, as well as identifying new skill sets that will be required in this transition process, as we would have more newer technologies and innovations which we'd have to embrace, and we should have a market a labor market which is ready to embrace the relevant skill sets as well. So in concluding, I would want to firstly wish the Republic of Korea all of the best in hosting of this virtual summit. And we are certainly looking forward to engaging on the thematic areas pre the high-level engagements at the end of May this year. And with that, I wish the summit all the best. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those fascinating opening remarks. I hope we will have a little bit of time to get back to some of the points that you've raised in our discussion session. But thank you, that was really great. It's a sort of a really bird's eye view of the policy landscape and some of the challenges associated with transitioning to a much more carbon-friendly economy. It's now my pleasure to introduce our third speaker on the panel, Mr. Christopher Rondemuller. He's a senior advisor on sustainable and smart cities at the Royal Danish Embassy here in South Africa. He's an experienced development consultant with deep knowledge of social housing and urban development, amongst others. The Smart and Sustainable Cities Program is a city-to-city partnership between the city of Tshwane in South Africa and the city of Aarhus in Denmark that seeks to bring public, private sector and research and science together to develop and implement good planning practices based on smart technology solutions to counter sprawl, congestion and rapid urbanization. He holds a master's in international development and social science from Roskilde University. Christopher, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, moderator, for that eloquent and beautiful introduction of me. I appreciate that. And thank you to Your Excellencies, Ambassador Park, P4g colleagues, government, whoever's online here. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this exciting webinar and to be part of such an important discussion about green and just transition. I think a lot has been said about just and green transition over the past few years, and as mentioned before, especially since the whole COVID-19 pandemic entered the stage. And I think we can all agree too that it's one of those terms that, you know, it's easy to agree, but it's very difficult to implement. Or so it seems, at least by the sort of global speed of implementation. And it was mentioned by the moderator earlier, we are actually the last generation that can actually do something tangible about changing the current situation. I think one of the main challenges is that in many ways, the economy moves faster than governments, policymakers, and even international organizations like P4g. And as important as it is that we meet in sessions like this and discuss and find a way forward, we often end up seeing that the economy has moved ahead of us and to a certain degree actually has recovered by the time that we have found a way forward. And that's one of the big challenges, obviously, and this is also why it's so important that we need to take a long-term view of the issue of green and just recovery. We basically only have this chance left. I'll talk a little bit about energy today, not because waste and water and food and agriculture and all the other topics that the P4g is dealing with are less important, but mainly because I think that Denmark has a lot to offer when it comes to energy transition. We've basically been transitioning our economy and our energy sector for the past 30 years. And today, approximately 50% of our energy is renewable, predominantly from wind. And it's been, I think it's fair to say, a fairly successful process in terms of the green and just agenda. We've lost jobs, but we've also gained new jobs. So we have a fair amount of experience to share with the world in this field. Denmark has recently convened a new global commission together with the International Energy Agency with the focus to put people at the center of energy transition policies. And the commission will deliver its recommendations to the COP26 in November, the climate change conference. And hopefully that will be an important contribution to the discussions that will happen there. And hopefully that will be followed up by quick action as well. The embassy in Denmark in general has had a really good collaboration, close collaboration with South Africa and DFFE and other ministries for many, many years. And we're pleased to see that the imperative of people-centered transition actually features in the integrated resource plan. There are policies and focus on policies needed to upskill people to service and maintain solar stations and wind farms, etc. But obviously the key thing is to get projects off the ground. And I think that is what P4g is all about. It is about putting actions between the words. And I think the P4g platform can hopefully be a sort of an accelerator or an incubator and enable us all that are here today to start developing projects and put some action to all the words. We've got projects now like the African Green Co, which is an energy intermediary that seeks to reduce energy prices and expand the renewable energy supply. That is one project under P4g. And I think this is just one example of a new structure and a new business model that has come out of P4g that has the potential to bring greener energy to more people and making it more just, basically at a better price. Another project that's come out of P4g that relates to the whole issue of green and just transition is a project called Getting to Zero, which basically seeks to get the shipping industry to zero emission and also develop new fuel sources such as green hydrogen. So there's a lot of opportunities looking at the built environment. We need to bring down energy consumption, which is roughly about 40% globally that goes into fueling our buildings. So there's lots of opportunities and a huge need for P4g at the moment. The key thing is obviously that we need to put people at the center of our green transition policies and involve people in the processes. We need new industrial policies, we need new labor policies, we need social protection measures in order for us to reach our goals. And we need new business models, as I mentioned before, where business and public sector and civil society comes together. In December, the Danish government announced that it will stop exploration of new oil and gas in the North Sea with a complete production stop in 2050. That means that a lot of jobs in the western part of Denmark will be lost. They are heavily dependent on oil and gas today. Therefore, the Danish government has taken the steps to assist in transforming the west coast of Denmark from a transit point for North Sea oil and gas into a hub for clean energy and clean technologies. This includes construction of wind farms, offshore wind farms, and the potential of using old oil wells to store CO2 captured from heavy industry and power plants. The same people whose companies were once involved in pumping the carbon up from the underground will now, in the future, be involved in pumping the carbon back underground. And this is a very good example of how a government can play a role in driving the economy, transitioning the economy, and we think this is a both green and just way forward. P4g's role is basically as a social enzyme that brings together business, government, and civil society to develop new things, something that we haven't seen before. And this is a very difficult task. It doesn't happen overnight. I think P4g, as I mentioned before, has taken some very important and tangible steps in demonstrating new ideas and new models with Africa Green Co, Getting to Zero, and a lot of other projects throughout the world. And I think it's very important that we use for us today to basically, what is the English word, sort of appreciate that and fuel more energy and more resources into P4g and projects that do the same thing around the world. And hopefully this will come in time. Yeah, and just final word, you know, tackling climate change and achieving a successful transition to clean energy is not a national endeavor. That is not something we can do individually. That is only something we can do by working together across all sectors, across countries, and across continents. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really fascinating overview and great examples of initiatives already underway in Denmark to transition towards a green economy. I actually have a couple of a round of questions for our panelists. And the first question that I'd like to ask is really related to the policy environment. I think all three speakers have emphasized how important the policy environment is to support a transition towards a green economy. And my question really is, what could be done to accelerate changes in the policy environment that is supportive of a more active private sector in transitioning towards a green economy? How do we, what is the type of environment that we need to support a much more active private sector? Do you have any suggestions or lessons that you can share with us or thoughts on that? Shall we start with Mr. Tonkili? You want to start us off?
Thank you, Noima. Yeah, maybe I think that we have a good experience to share with you to accelerate the participation of the private sector, especially the participation of the business sector is important for us. Maybe the important for all around the world, because business sector is quite the powerful and has lots of capacity. Maybe this is kind of some the unique experience in Korea. As you know, the Korea has the very huge dependency on the trade. So Korean business sector is very keen to the change of the some trends around the world. Nowadays, you know, the EU declared to introduce some carbon adaptation mechanism, so-called the carbon tax, carbon border tax. Also, the US mentioning about the similar schemes. So Korean business sector is very eager to introduce and adapt themselves to this new trend. They declared kind of some RE100, renewable energy, 100%. And also 2050 carbon neutrality, even POSCO. This is a famous Korean steel maker declared 2050 carbon neutrality. So I become to think that some global solidarity or the international cooperation toward carbon neutrality by 2050, this kind of some shift to a green economy will accelerate the participation of business sectors and private sectors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think those signals are incredibly important to get the private, to also build the confidence of the private sector that there is a very specific move in the direction, in a particular direction, and that policymakers are actually behind them. Unita, can I ask you from your perspective, from the South African perspective, what are your thoughts on the policy environment involved, getting the private sector actively involved?
Thank you for that question. I would want to perhaps pitch or use the Carbon Tax Act as an example, which actually determines the amount of time that it takes to actually get a policy in place or a piece of legislation promulgated. I mean, the Treasury started that process probably in 2011, 2012, was out in 2014 and undertook a process wherein they used, they proposed a voluntary offset program by private sector at that point. And this lasted until, I think it was May 2015, or I may be corrected, it could have been May 2016. But the actual piece of legislation was only promulgated in May 2019. Or in 2019 when we had the current administration in place. So as much as we'd want to accelerate a whole lot of green economy sector related legislation or policies, it depends on how the interested or affected parties react to a policy change or a policy proposal. And if your affected and interested parties are not ready, if the country is not there yet, it becomes a bit of a challenge. You have to consult over and over again, and obviously negotiate every article in that particular document that is then something that the affected parties or interested parties are accepting of. So what happens usually is you can also take a proactive bottoms-up approach wherein you can test. So that is what offsets before the policy became legislation and was promulgated as an act. And that helps you to gauge the extent of certainty, extent of readiness as well for markets to actually embrace something like that. It's easier with regard to amendments. We have existing legislation, although this does take some time as well, because you've got to go and consult with the relevant stakeholders on such amendments as well. And but the time taken to actually undertake the necessary amendments may be shorter in comparison to introducing new pieces of legislation. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's really an important point. You know, the fact that it does take a lot of time sometimes to get these changes regulated, and in a way that's actually sensitive to all the stakeholders that are involved. But I think just building on what you said, the 10% of the total budget, the 1 trillion budget, 1 trillion rand budget that is required in the South African case to transition to a green economy has been secured, and we still have to work on securing the 90%. I think it really is important to bring as many stakeholders on board as possible. Christopher, from your side, your view on what can be done. There obviously are some really good examples in the Danish case. Perhaps you can share with us what was done. You know, what created the greatest momentum in terms of from an policy enabling perspective to create greater involvement and support from the private sector.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think looking at it from the Danish perspective, the private sector is always ready to get involved. I think the main thing that they're asking for us as policymakers, politicians, etc., is basically, you know, transparency and long-term compromises, so they know how to plan ahead long term. And we've always sort of practiced the principle of the carrot and the stick. It's about creating a policy environment where you sort of punish the wrongdoers and reward the guys that do well, basically. And unfortunately, majority of companies actually want to do well, if it makes economically sense, of course, for them. So I think we've had the fortunate of being sort of a consensus society where across the board of political parties, we're able to put together, you know, compromises on climate change and economic policy and so forth that brings long-term stability to our economy. And if there's something an economy likes, and if there's something also, I think climate change transition needs, it's long-term implementation and long-term sort of perspectives and views. So without being too technical about it, that's basically what's driving our policy development, is a sort of very center and very inclusive way of doing things, democratic, very founded.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's absolutely correct. I think for the private sector, it is very important to have a sense of a really long-term perspective and certainty. In the time that we have left, I actually do want to ask a quick question to our panelists, because you've all mentioned the importance of a just transition. I mean, this is an inclusive and just transition. We've heard this several times in the climate debates, and actually, Christopher, you gave a great example of a very practical approach to, I think, for really forward thinking in terms of how to deal with the oil industry in Denmark. The question that I have to all our panelists is really, how do we make sure that people are at the center of these policies? You know, we talk about questions like lost jobs and newly created jobs, the possibility of skilling for the new economy, but also then the question around reskilling, you know, those people whose jobs that will be affected. I mean, I don't have to elaborate too much on, for example, the highly carbon intensive power sector that we have in South Africa. and the implications actually for Eskom and for everybody that actually relies, the mining sector, all those jobs that actually relies on our current energy model. In terms of ensuring a just transition, what are some of the key issues or some of the key lessons that can be shared from your perspective in terms of both sequencing, thinking about, how do you gear for reskilling, for creation of new jobs? What are the things that we do need to think about as from a policy perspective to make this possible? Christopher, I'm going to start with you this time, if you don't mind. You gave such great examples already, but you might have some additional thoughts that you might want to add. Christoph, we can't hear you. Sorry, we can't hear you.
Apologies for that. I was just saying that's a very good question, and the answer is a lot of things have to be done basically at the same time. Before I mentioned we need like new industrial policies, we need labor market policy, we need social protection measures, we need education policy, reskilling, like you mentioned yourself. And I think that the challenge is basically putting together a coherent policy framework where all of these things come together in a way where they sort of enable, this transition to take place. And that's a very difficult exercise to go about. I think especially in a country, for instance, like South Africa, that, where unfortunately the economics are like they are, state-owned enterprises that don't have a lot of money, high unemployment and so on. It's a very, very difficult and long-term process. I think one of the most important things is obviously like the issue of reskilling people and have huge programs in place that can basically bring people from one industry to another. I don't necessarily think that the solution is just creating a lot of manual labor, because I think those are short-term solutions. I think the world moves ahead with fast technology development and we've got artificial intelligence and all these kind of things, and we have to keep up with that. I don't think we can just keep producing manual labor, but we do have to look at how do we prepare people to enter a new type of economy. But having said that, if you look at the solar industry, there are lots of manual jobs also, maintaining and mounting solar, etc. So it can be done, but it's a very difficult question actually, because it's on the whole range of instruments that you have to basically fine tune and get it right. That was a little bit of a diplomatic answer, almost like a non-answer, huh?
No, I think you reflect the complexity and the difficulties. Janita, do you want to respond from the South African perspective?
Yes, thank you. Without necessarily reiterating what Christopher has alluded to earlier on, I think it's important for us to also acknowledge the fact that sometimes it's difficult to reskill people. It also depends on what age bracket these affected individuals may be at. And you'd have to look for alternative solutions that ensures there's a win-win situation or a proposal that's made available on the table. I would personally think that if we had to pursue or advance potentially new and emerging industries, wherein we know that we have a huge unemployment rate sitting amongst the youth, the potential to actually reskill them, upskill them, and perhaps expose them to new skills would be a better shot than looking at those who need to transition out of carbon-intensive industries, for example, and may not be able to embrace the change from a learning perspective. It was in 2017 when we put out the Green Economy Learning Assessment through the Partnership for Action on the Green Economy. And what we found was that majority of those who are experts in the space of the green economy have been, as a result of being much more proactive and taking up skill sets or advancing their own educations within their own spaces and not necessarily going through a formal process of training. So, learning by doing, for example, spending a lot of time doing literature reviews and exposing oneself to other best practices, etc., which has actually given them the added advantage and the edge in the space that they find themselves in currently. So I think also, there's been a lot of focus regarding the energy transition in South Africa, and Mpumalanga has definitely come under the spotlight. We've had lots of partners, external partners also focusing attention there on how we actually do this coal transition. So it's good to watch that space and see what are some of the learning curves that will come out of it and what type of green economy industries could replace these existing industries that are carbon intensive. There are specific sectors wherein such interventions are required, and the National Employment Vulnerability Assessment, which was completed recently, is a good indication which talks to some of the sectors, including the coal transition, as well as agriculture, tourism, etc. So there are certain low-hanging fruits which we could advance at speed with. It also means that academia has to be on par with where the priorities of government is, and the research that is required is also in line with where we would see ourselves as a country in the medium to long term. So these kinds of issues have to be addressed in parallel. It cannot happen, in a linear kind of fashion or mode, for that matter. Thanks.
No, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I think just in terms of also the points raised around new technologies emerging and actually emerging very fast. So, for example, in the context of work that SAI is currently doing on the hydrogen or the green hydrogen economy for South Africa, it is very clear indeed that there needs to be not only a very serious re-engagement with both our learning culture, the one point that you've raised here, but also the closing this loop between the scientific community, the business community, and our educational institutions, and the variety of our educational institutions. And that's my last question then to Mr. Tonkili. Are there examples from the Korean perspective of how business and your science community and your academic community, your training institutions are working together to gear for essentially the green economy and the transition that is actually coming with the fourth industrial revolution?
Thank you, Noima. I sound some difficult questions. I think that's why we choose the inclusive green recovery toward the carbon neutrality as a theme of the P4g Summit. The change or the responding to climate change needs quite the comprehensive change and the shifts of the economic landscape. So there could be some losers, and then there could be some winners. So there are always some confrontational debate between the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of the Industry. As you mentioned, for this kind of great and a huge transition, we need the participation of all stakeholders, include the business sectors and the academia, and also civil society. in our experience, for this kind of the inclusive change, we need genuine support from the society. For this kind of support, we need genuine awareness of the public for the need of the change. Just 2 years ago, we were faced with the very worst air pollution issues, and we introduced very various measures from government side. Government wants to lead and wants to show their strong will and strong policy to tackle the air pollution. But every policy introduced by the government itself was failed. After that, we organize kind of some public hearings, series of the public hearings and the participation to force good policy to tackle air pollution. After that, we got strong support from the public, and we can introduce quite strong measures, even stop the operation of the coal power plants. So I think this kind of a very strong policy measures was possible just because of the strong support from the public. That could be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that feedback, and thank you so much to our panelists of this round. I'm extending a virtual hand clap to everybody. Thank you very much for your contributions. It's now my pleasure to hand over to the moderator of our next session on learning from existing public partnerships, collaboration and pilot projects. And the moderator for the session is Ms. Leila Yumsurat. She's the Director for Strategy and Engagement from the P4g Secretariat. She leads on strategy and engagement for the Partnering for Green Growth and Global Goals 2030 initiative. P4g brings together business, government, and civic organizations to incubate and accelerate innovative public-private partnerships in 5 key areas: food and agriculture, water, energy, cities, and the circular economy. In this capacity, she's responsible for engaging partner countries, businesses, financiers, and civil society to support the goals of P4g, including through P4g's country platforms, partnerships, board of directors, and global summits. Prior to joining P4g, she served as the interim CEO and chief operating officer at the Center for Clean Air Policy. She brings a breadth of experience from both the government and private sectors. She holds an MBA from Stanford University and a BA in economics from Yale University. Over to you, please, Leila. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hear an echo. Okay, it sounds like it's been fixed. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And also just want to express our appreciation on behalf of all of P4g, first and foremost to the Republic of Korea for hosting the summit, for Denmark for launching P4g. This was in 2018. And also the South African Institute of International Affairs for hosting this wonderful platform. And then finally, and especially for South Africa Department of Forestry, Fisheries, and the Environment, and especially Dr. Badul for her strong support for P4g as we have been working to bring the partnerships in support of South Africa's goals and launch the national platform. So very much appreciate the collaboration that we have with DEF. I'd like to provide a brief overview of the P4g program and to provide the framing for the 2 partnerships that will be presented during this next session to give you examples of how P4g is bringing together the private sector, the government, civil society to mobilize private sector investment and bring green infrastructure to countries to help them to meet their SDG and climate change goals. If someone could please put up my slides, or I can share if I need to. Let's see. I'll go ahead. Nima,
Teresa, can you help? Can you help Leila there?
Sure, I will.
Thank you.
And I very much appreciated the remarks from the last discussion session, which really focused on, several key points of the foundation of P4g. One is that we can't individually do it alone to meet these ambitious climate goals. And that is one of the core aspects of P4g, where really you need true partnerships, genuine partnerships between government, private sector, and civil society. And then secondly, the need to be mobilizing private sector investment, additional investment to the green infrastructure. And Dr. Badul mentioned that, right now they've identified 10% of the investments needed to achieve their goals, which leaves this gap of 90%. And that is, one of the main reasons why P4g was established, to help serve as a delivery mechanism for countries' ambitious climate goals. Wonderful. So if you could please go to the second slide. So that P4g's core mission is to be a global delivery platform for the 2030 agenda, as well as for countries' SDGs, climate change goals. I can see that we're trying to switch to the second slide at this point.
Teresa, I think it's, if you can just on the right-hand side in the right bar, just click a little bit down.
It's, I'm trying to, Noema, it's a PDF. I'm just going to do it now.
Okay.
And I can just continue on. So P4g is a network of 12 partner countries, including the Republic of Korea, Denmark, the Netherlands, South Africa. And if you please go to the next slide. And our global network of countries is an important part of what we bring to the table to help these very specific partnerships that we're supporting. In addition, we're comprised of 5 global organizations, the World Resources Institute, C40 Cities, the International Finance Corporation, World Economic Forum, and 3GI, which is based in Seoul. The bringing together of these global organizations, bringing their knowledge to how to accelerate green development is, again, one of the ways that we contribute to the individual partnerships that we're supporting. If you go to the next slide. So core to what P4g is about is that we work with our partner countries to co-create partnerships. We invest in these partnerships and help to accelerate them by connecting them with the global network as well as the national network within each of our partner countries that bring together civil society, the government, the key government ministries, as well as private sector. And through this engaged process, we deliver results on the ground. And you'll be hearing about 2 of the specific partnerships that we're supporting. Going to the next slide. We support partnerships in 5 core SDGs: food and agriculture, clean water, affordable and clean energy, sustainable cities, and circular economy. And really the work that we do is in order to bring concrete investment and deal flow to green infrastructure in our partner countries by leveraging our investments and mobilizing private sector investments, achieving greater impact, and then connecting the work that's being done on the ground, these concrete actions, to the global network and to being able to tap into additional resources, additional financing, and connecting to other countries and other partners who can help scale these innovative models globally. And that really is the core of what P4g is about. Going to the last slide, we currently have now over 50 partnerships that we've been supporting in these 5 SDGs, and are excited to continue to deepen the impact in our partner countries. We are currently in the middle of our 4th call for partnerships, and look forward to working with South Africa and our partners to co-create new innovative models that we can help to support and accelerate. And at this point, we can go off the slides, and I'd like to now introduce our first presenter for our first partnership. And this is Rachel Mountain with Energize Africa, and she is the head of marketing and has been leading the charge on how to bring in innovative financing to help green energy on the ground in Africa. So at this point, I'd love to turn it over to Rachel.
Thanks, Leila, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone, excellencies, ambassadors, and fellow colleagues kind of looking at tackling this, climate change problem in South Africa and beyond. So yeah, I'm presuming I'm okay to share my slides. Let's do that. Okay, hopefully. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Brilliant. So as Leila mentioned, Energize Africa is all about sort of mainstreaming people-powered impact investing to deliver on Sustainable Goal 7, universal energy access for all. And essentially, we've been lucky enough to be working with the P4g team as a startup partnership in 2018, and now a scale-up partnership from 2020. So just quickly setting the context for what we do. So we've got a really ambitious goal in the next 5 years to put clean energy within the financial reach of 50 million people by mobilizing $1 billion in people-powered finance for the SDGs. We said primarily our focus is on SDG 7, but obviously our model in terms of innovative finance can be replicated across other SDGs. So how we work is we look at different ways that we can blend catalytic finance alongside individual people investing from £50. So we're all about making impact investing accessible. And then we blend those investments with institutional finance from UKA, Virgin Unite and Good Energies in a mixture of ways. So it can be guarantees, first loss funding, match funding, co-investment, and we're pioneering new approaches all the time in projects that are raising finance via the platform from solar businesses. And so a solar business, what we allow them to do is raise finance in flexible ways according to their inventory needs. So they may need £3 million of financing during the course of 2 years, but what they can do is come in smaller tranches and raise investments by issuing bonds onto the platform. And those bonds are then invested in by a mixture of individual people and institutions. Energize Africa was set up in 2017. by two European impact investing platforms, FX and Lend a Hand. FX is very active in the UK in sustainable energy, sustainable transport space, and Lend a Hand is much more focused on emerging markets, SDG impact investing for individuals, but within the Netherlands and Belgium and wider European countries. So to date, we've mobilised £21 million of investment. That would have been higher, but we've been working last year with the impact of COVID to refinance and do a lot of work to enable these solar businesses to, you know, continue and grow. And so that 21 million has meant that 560,000 people across 14 African countries have access to affordable renewable energy, and has helped to mitigate 123 tonnes of CO2. And in terms of proof of concept, we've repaid £10.4 million back to investors. So just to give you an idea of the depth of experience of the two founding partners behind Energize Africa. So combined Lend a Hand and FX have 30,000 active individual investors across Europe investing via our platforms that we leverage to generate investment through Energize Africa. We've supported 100 plus organisations across 23 countries, and are just shy of our £200 million mark invested over the past 5 years. So we've got a good track record, but there's the climate finance gap is 3.8 trillion, so there's lots more to do. So just looking briefly at the impact, we've mentioned the amount of people that can now afford to have access to renewable energy via monthly payment plans. One of the main reasons that Energize Africa was set up, because the lack of finance was impacting the rollout of solar energy across a lot of African countries. So we've stepped in to provide that financing that other traditional institutions wouldn't typically be providing without significant collateralization requirements. We've talked about the sort of impact around CO2 emissions, but also productive use solar has been great in helping to kind of support 7,000 micro and small to medium-sized enterprises, with income and new business ideas. And moving on, that has enabled households to also earn additional income up to around $20 million worth of additional income. But I think one of the things that we're really sort of interested in is how through our partnerships and our institutional investors investing alongside individuals, is that we've really kind of pushed the boundaries on the public-private leverage rate that we can see with our investments. So typically for Africa, the ODI, an ODI report said that for every $1 of public funding flowing into Africa, only 0.70 cents was generated in private sector investment. We're generating £5 of investment into African countries for every pound of foundation and government money, and we're looking to obviously accelerate that ratio further. So just to give you a flavour of one of our investments in South Africa. So Candy is operating in the commercial and industrial solar space. It's raised in the last 6 months more than 1.4 million on Energize Africa from 900 investors. If you include additional investments made by Lend a Hand, that's 2.5 million. And it's supporting their growth in South Africa predominantly, but also they've got subsidiaries in India too. The working capital finance that we've provided them has been instrumental in them being able to install 2,500 kilowatts of solar capacity. And they, as a result, there's the avoided CO2 emissions, but also what's really interesting is we've been blending finance from Good Energies Foundation to really kind of motivate the crowd to support Candy Solar, but they have over 100 megawatts of a further pipeline that they need financing. And obviously we're, hoping to provide that kind of financing to enable them to roll out and achieve and deliver on that pipeline over the next few years. So the theme obviously is really, really important in terms of, carbon neutrality, but, making sure that it is a just transition. And for us, there are some really systemic issues in the finance sector. And so we talked about policy, government policy, and I would say it's down to being brave by UK Aid and P4g that we're in this position in terms of pioneering new things, because the sustainable businesses in the energy space and across other, sustainable sectors such as sustainable transport, agriculture, forestry, the current financial institutions aren't willing to lend to the new kind of business models that are emerging. And so we are working, with our supporters and with P4g to really design and develop products that lend to those core heights and those groups in a way that they need. So it's flexible, it's affordable, it's streamlined, and it really enables them to grow. We're doing that, and we mentioned, earlier how technology is a real enabler. So technology is enabling us in the finance space, to connect and streamline and take out the middlemen and really kind of drive operational efficiencies through our platform. But it's also delivering for individual investors the products that they can't get currently in the market. So there's a big frustration in the UK and Europe that financial institutions aren't providing the accessible products, the transparent products that investors want. And there's a degree of suspicion over greenwashing and what are you actually investing in. So we're really using technology to drive and deliver those products that individual investors want to see. And actually, given the pandemic, given climate change is much more front and center of the political imperative right now, is much more on people's radar. And we're doing that in a way, offering products where the risks are mitigated to individual investors by, taking new approaches to blending finance from governments, foundations, and other multilateral development banks to really kind of push the public-private leverage ratios. And so for us, this people-powered transition, society is really important, in terms of delivering investment to businesses that can really bring about this green transition in a way that works for everyone, but also in providing products, where people can actually funnel and invest their money in the types of sustainable initiatives that they want to see. So, moving forwards, we're really keen to accelerate that and bring on board new sectors in a way that can really make retail finance, an important part of the climate financing mix. I'll finish there and hand back to Leila. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. This is a terrific example about what we mean when we say we're looking for partnerships that can help mobilize funds and also support local businesses. Just a terrific example. At this point now, I'd like to turn it over to Anna Hajuka with our second partnership that we've been supporting over several years, and have seen the partnership go from the initial plans to bringing in some investments and now to be launched as this, active investment platform and to promote renewable energy development. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to the CEO of Africa Green Co.
Thank you, Leila. Very kind of you. Thank you for the kind introduction. Your Excellencies, ambassadors, it's my absolute honor to be with you here today. A number of topics have already been tackled, but let me try and incorporate some of them in my presentation today. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. I think we spoke about COVID quite a bit and the impact it has had across the world, but in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. The impacts are unprecedented and will continue being so, as a consequence of which the focus on renewable energy in order to achieve the just transition that we have all been talking about is truly the only way forward in our view. It's not only because of climate change, it's not because it is clean, but it is simply the cheapest option at the moment when it comes to new generation in sub-Saharan Africa. There's quite a lot of information on this slide. I will not go through it, but the conclusion or the reality that it is the cheapest option should remain at the back of our minds. Of course, in sub-Saharan Africa, we do know that the energy investment needs are truly immense, but consequently, so are the opportunities. What do we see, however? We see that the current model of how we are bringing these renewables on board rely on very much a single buyer, the local utility, often having to be backed by government for its payment obligations in order to make the transaction bankable. As a development community, we are focusing on bringing new generation on board mostly over the past 10 to 20 years, and perhaps disregarding wider transmission, distribution, and other requirements which are more of a systemic nature. So currently, the model which brings on board a new generation really is one that requires significant government liability to back the power purchase obligations of the utility. And the utilities often lack effective operational risk mitigation in order to mitigate their own risks and are often not compensated for wider balancing, use of system, ancillary services, and other technical services that they do need to perform. South Africa is lauded as an example where more renewable generation has been brought on board than anywhere else in sub-Saharan Africa, but so has been also the fiscal impact on the South African treasury, which has had to back those power purchase obligations. We believe that the current model of how we are bringing this renewable energy generation is limited. It is restricting market development. We are focusing on generation for generation's sake and not focusing on wider systemic changes. Most utilities, as we know, are not creditworthy. The IPPs require risk cover and payment security instruments to make their projects bankable. This increases the cost of capital, reduces operational financial flexibility, and truly what we see is that new business models are needed. And there is a realization across Southern Africa, in particular in Zambia, in Namibia, in Zimbabwe, and South Africa, that new business models are needed and that a move from single buyer model is required. So here is where we introduce Africa GreenCo, which is a private sector company supported by the P4g. We believe that we are introducing a truly novel model, one whereby we are acting as a creditworthy buyer of renewable energy in the region. We buy power from independent power producers and we on-sell it to a number of different partners, not only to the single buyer utility, but also to customers across different industries, to utilities themselves. And most importantly, we look at the Southern African power pool competitive markets for risk diversification and mitigation. GreenCo, through the support of the P4g, has obtained funding from the Danish IFU and PIGS Infraco Africa, which allows it to combine a strong balance sheet in order to give the creditworthy PPA to the IPP, and together with that, it's able to operationally mitigate the risk of that supply by having a number of customers on the demand side and by utilizing the power pool. So really what GreenCo is trying to achieve is to use the market and not the single buyer model and single demand requirements of a single country to mitigate the long-term price and demand risk. Because the existing Southern African power pool is already there. we ignore it to our peril. Only through this wider regional power pool can we see and find an alternative route to market, which eventually breaks the sovereign ceiling of particular countries and the requirements for that government's fiscal to back those power purchase obligations. So what is our vision? Our vision is to lead innovation and sustainably transform renewable energy markets in Africa. Where are we active? Currently in Zambia and Namibia, and looking to become more active in South Africa in Q3 or 4 of this year. In South Africa, this is because South African energy transition is well and truly underway. There are extremely exciting developments at the moment that one can see in the South African energy space. First of all, widespread recognition that reliance just on Eskom as the single buyer is no longer sustainable, both from Eskom's perspective and perspective of the other participants. Estimates for additional capacity range from 3,000 to 7,000 megawatts, which is yet to be procured, and this capacity has to be backed by alternative buyers and not only Eskom. The regulator NERSA is already questioning the viability of all new procurement being via a single buyer model. And there was a recent recognition that the municipal procurement of IPP is critical to energy-led economic recovery. Therefore, we believe this, together with the reality that South Africa's fiscal situation, especially after COVID-19, is particularly fragile, it means that exploring innovative and collaborative new business models like GreenCo is very important to allow South Africa to achieve its targets. I think I have a minute left, but just to continue with this slide, which really showcases that both in the embedded generation space and in the municipality space in particular, there are great benefits of having intermediaries like GreenCo and power traders who are looking to diversify the risks across a portfolio of buyers in order to facilitate bringing on board new generation without payment guarantees by the South African National Treasury and introducing new generation with a view to compensate the very utility Eskom and the municipalities for their wheeling, use of system, ancillary, balancing, and other services that they inevitably have to perform when it comes to integration of intermittent renewable energy generation onto their system. Why are we doing this? We are doing this because we want to leverage $2.5 billion by 2030 through an aggressive pipeline of projects across Southern Africa, for which we will act as a credit-worthy PPA counterparty and power trader on the back end. In terms of vision as to why, it's only because of systemic change. Focus just on generation is not sustainable. Creating markets for that generation is what will allow the power sectors across Southern Africa to be self-sustainable and to achieve the electrification targets that we all need, both for achievement of SDG 7 and the other SDGs, in addition to achieving the climate change targets that we are all aiming for. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Would be delighted to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that very clear and inspiring model that you've put forward. It's been exciting to see the development of Africa GreenCo. We have maybe 2 minutes left before I'd like to then turn it over to Ambassador Tobias Elling to close this webinar. Before that, though, I'd like to pose to each of you, what would you say has been sort of the key value added of or uniqueness of P4g's approach? Because I know both of you have dealt with multiple donors and multiple entities to help start up your businesses. Maybe I can turn it over to Rachel to answer in 1 minute.
Thanks, Bella. So for us, having experience with different donors, I just think the sheer sort of activeness and dynamic partnership that P4g brings to the table is great. The fact that you're looking at driving not incremental change, it's transformational change. So getting us as partnerships to think slightly differently, pushing the ambition level, and just having that, that dynamic nature of being able to introduce us to the right stakeholders at the right time, I think has been truly instrumental for us in shifting our sort of focus from slightly linear progression to more like, well, what do we need to do to make a much bigger impact much more quickly? So yeah, I would just say, the kind of the introductions, the active nature of the role, the getting us to be ambitious, by far, and away much more ambitious than we were before. We had the P4g dialogue. So just commend you guys for doing that and really making us think about pushing the boundaries further.
Wonderful. Anna.
I think I second everything that Rachel said. I mean, P4g brings with itself a whole ecosystem that we can rely on, not only informationally, not only contact-wise, but also with a focus on accelerating both our implementation in Zambia and Namibia, but also really looking at accelerating elsewhere. How are we going to grow in South Africa? How are we going to grow together in order to achieve impacts as wide as possible? Ours is a completely regional business model in nature. The more we diversify our own risks across the Southern African power pool on the supply and demand basis, the more we ourselves are successful, and the more, in turn, a renewable energy generation will we attract across those countries where we operate. And I think that completely aligns and has been aligned with the vision of the P4g in terms of both transformative change, but more importantly, moving away from the current very static system into a completely different way of looking at new generation in the region. So it's a partnership, and it's an absolute honor to be part of that family. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna and Rachel, for presenting and for those terrific remarks. At this point, I'd like to now turn it over for closing remarks to Ambassador Tobias Elling, and also just to express our collective appreciation. This whole program, P4g, was launched by Denmark 3 years ago now, over 3 years ago. And it's wonderful to see the results that we've been producing, and just, appreciate the support from Denmark, from the Republic of Korea, from the Kingdom of the Netherlands, who are all our foundational supporters, funders. And at this point, I'll turn it over to the ambassador. Thank you. I don't hear you. I don't know if there's an issue with the connection.
Thank you very much. Out of the Limpopo province in South Africa, for windmill. So I brought my own. I am back, I think. First of all, I would like to thank all our friends for hosting this webinar within the framework of Partnering for Green Growth and Global Goals, P4g. In preparation of the P4g World Summit a little bit later this year. Now, the P4g Summit comes at a time when the COVID-19 pandemic is still raging in very many parts of the world. However, in some parts, we're beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel due to the rollout of the vaccination programs. That, of course, means that in 2020, the global economy was really challenged. However, it should be said that some parts of the economy still did pretty well. Logistics and shipping, for instance, we have great big companies, Maersk and DSV, two of the largest logistic companies in the world. They did very well in 2020, and 2021 is on track to becoming a record year for these companies. It's a bit of a paradox, and it goes to show how unpredictable and difficult it is to forecast the future and the future economic trends. But we do know that the general pattern in a crisis, whether it being the financial crisis in the zeros or the COVID-19 pandemic in the 20s is a decline in the global production and economic growth. The upside is, of course, less global emission of greenhouse gases. However, this is typically followed by a boom in the global production, economic growth, and a matching and very unwanted boom in emissions of greenhouse gases. The question is, of course, how we can change this emission pattern and how we can address the long-term climate goals and secure a much more sustainable and inclusive and a resilient economic recovery, especially in the part of the world where I am right now. Now, this is, of course, a huge challenge, and it's as my colleague Christopher said before, it's one that no country or no company can tackle alone. On the contrary, governments, together with private and social partners, needs to forge this new, inclusive and sustainable paradigm. A paradigm that will set us on track for a more sustainable and a more just future. Just to return to my own country, in 2019, the Danish government set our climate goals. We are now committed to lower our emissions by 70% in 2030. That's just in nine years. It's a very ambitious target. That being said, green transition is not new for us. We started this when I was just born in the early 70s, where we at that time were heavily dependent on fossil fuels, on coal and so on. Now, of course, in the beginning, this transition was primarily initiated by the Danish government out of a consideration for climate, for environmental issues, and so on. But I think we quite quickly realized that green transition is not just a big benefit for the environment and the climate. It's also a huge opportunity for the Danish economy to grow and to prosper in an emerging green market. And that's just our economy. This is, of course, an example that anyone can take. I think, as I've said earlier, South Africa has one of the huge or the biggest potentials for this kind of green transition in the world due to the natural potential of solar and wind in this country. It is an opportunity to be a front runner in green technology. It's also an opportunity to create sustainable jobs. And as some of you might know, today more than 50% of all energy used in Denmark is from a renewable energy source. Now, this story, this little fairy tale from Denmark, it proves that, of course, governments have a very important role to play when it comes to securing and enabling environment for green transformation and green growth. Governments can set a direction through our policy development, through our initiatives, through taxes, but business and civil society really must play their role for any transition to be really successful. Only when green business is good business, we can see a proper green transformation. As an old friend of the Danish embassy is singing, times are a-changing. And we do now see the contours of a new global power map driven by green hydrogen production, which in the near future policy development, through our initiatives, through taxes, but business and civil society really. Sorry, there was a little of a fallout there. But we can see the contours of a new global power map driven by green hydrogen production, which in the near future will have the potential for very large-scale job creation and economic growth, specifically here in the developing world. This is driven by new technologies and this calls for new types of partnerships between public, private sector and the civil society. This can be a game changer, but we really have to seize the opportunity. And this is exactly why the P4g platform and the P4g summit is so important. The world needs new pioneers to prototype and to pilot new types of collaborations, new types of partnerships that will push us towards a greener and more just economy and a more just future. Now, hopefully our webinar today is just a small but important step in growing these partnerships. And I wish to thank all of you for your participation and for your extremely interesting and valuable contributions. Thank you very much from Limpopo.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And with your last closing remarks, we've come to the end of this event. It's just a very quick thank you then from SIA's side again for a great partnership, a great event, and to all our expert panelists for your time and your inputs and insights. And as you said, Ambassador, it's just a taste of things to come. It's actually could be an incredibly positive story, not only for everybody, for people concerned from a perspective of a people-centered approach, but also for our planet, which ultimately is the home, our home that we need to look after a lot more carefully. So thank you very much to everybody, and especially to our Korean colleagues as well. We wish you a good evening in Korea and a good afternoon to the rest of the colleagues here in South Africa and elsewhere. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.